Welcome to this video on repairing the infills between timber beams. This is a typical internal wall which has seen better days obviously. Your wall may just have a section of plaster missing or loose, and in a later video I'll show you how to make good that particular damage. Okay, so let's get started. This shows a typical wall configuration. Right, so this is the outside of the house. As you can see, I've taken away most of the cement rendering, but you can see there the laths running across the wall. The beam at the bottom there is sitting on a small dwarf wall, which is fairly typical for this type of house. Right, let's have a look at the inside a little bit closer now. So, moving in, what you can see here is that we've actually built a frame inside where the infill sits, all the way round, screwing this tightly onto the main beams. I've used 38 by 25 battening, roof battening, which is sort of cheap and readily available. As you can see, I've put the insulation in between the battens, but providing a gap between the insulation and the inside of the outside wall. This will ensure that no condensation will form on the inside between the insulation and the outer wall. If you want to, you can put insulating tape all the way around just to fix the insulation to the framing that you've just fixed. So just in summary, the red framing there shows the roof battens that you're putting around the inside of the timber frame. The red here shows the insulation which is fitted between the battens. And finally, the wood wall board, which is shown again in red, which would cover right up to the edges of the timber, but remain a couple of millimetres below the surface, so you've got room to add the plaster. Right, let's go back to the main wall. So this is a sample I'm doing, just so that you can see exactly what's done. I'm using some scrap timber here, but anything that sort of comes to hand or roof battens would do. And basically what you're trying to do is to just provide a frame on which to mount the insulation, and then over the top the wood wall board. So don't worry too much about joints and things like that. All you're doing is providing an edge which is set back from the front of the timber, just to ensure that you have a good finish when you've completed. Right, so let's get these pieces of timber screwed onto the wall. I'm just using conventional wood screws here, and you don't really need to put a pilot hole into the timber, because the timber is quite soft and the framing is very hard. You should really put the screws sort of probably once every foot, but don't worry too much about how many screws you put in there. The other thing you can do is to use some no nails between the timber you're putting in and the frame, just to avoid drafts. Right, I think that looks pretty secure. We'll just put the final screws in, and then we can carry on and put the insulation in. Just a word here about the integrity of the existing beams and the historic nature of what you're repairing. It's very important that you don't damage, or damage as little as possible, the existing timber, and never cut out a beam. Before we actually start, it's just important to note that whilst I'm going to be using some names of particular products, we're not sponsored by anybody at all other than Dry Ice Restoration, who clean beams. Right, so for this I'm going to be using inch thick Celotex boarding. It's sort of readily available and actually quite cheap really for sort of an 8x4 sheet. You don't need to get it too accurate here, and the best thing to do is just to align it up where it looks right, put some pencil marks, and then you can cut this material just with a saw, or in fact a razor blade, and then just bend it in half, a bit like plasterboard, and then you can just cut the foil at the back, and that'll be a nice size. If you find that you've got gaps all the way around, what you can do is you can actually use some foam from a dispensing can, this insulation foam, and that will actually give you a good tight fit, again to avoid drafts if your walls on the outside have got any cracks in or anything like that. Take your time when fitting this boarding, because it is quite important to make sure you have as little air gaps as possible. Right, that looks pretty good. That's going in there quite nicely. It's nice and tight on one edge, which means that you can jam it in there and it should hold itself quite nicely. Again, you can put tape around that if you want to, just to make sure that it fits properly. If you've got a minor gap, or a sort of gap you can just see there, what you can do, as I'm showing you here, is just to run a saw blade all the way down. Mind your fingers, and you can run that right the way down until you can get a nice good fit. Once you've done that, clear all the rubbish out from the inside, and then give it a good push down. Right, so let's have a look at the Salivite. Well, Salivite is the trade name, but this is a wood wall board, so it looks a bit like Weetabix. I think it's a cement-based material, and what you can see here is this particular one is 15mm thick. I think you can get them up to 25mm thick, but for the purposes of this, I'm actually using 15. So you can saw this material with a standard wood saw. Any type of saw will do. Right, the Salivite board is quite easy to use. You can cut it, as I've shown, using an ordinary tenon saw. You need to get it fairly tight in, but don't worry too much if you've got gaps all the way around. This will just be filled with plaster at a later date. What I do here is just to offer up the board and just strike a mark with a pencil, and then just cut that off with a saw, and then refit it and just keep trimming it until it fits nicely for you. Right, to fix the Salivite to the framing, you're going to be screwing into the battening that you've screwed around the outside. You probably need to fit screws probably every 8 or 9 inches, and you do this using a washer and a screw. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the washers. This is really what spreads the load to stop it crushing the Salivite. So you use standard screws through that hole, make sure the dish is down into the material, and then screw them down tight. But don't try and screw them in too tight, otherwise it will actually squash the boarding. Just nip them in, just so that it embeds the washer into the Salivite board and gives you a fairly flush fit. You don't want it raised too much, otherwise when you do the plastering you'll see bits of washer sticking out of your plasterwork. That depends of course on how much plaster you're putting on top. Right, so that's fixed good and proper, and now on to the next stage. And this is probably the most important stage. This is where you need to decide whether or not you're going to get your beams blasted and get them nice and clean and fresh. Here at Dry Ice Restoration we can offer media blasting or dry ice, and that really depends on what's on your beams, whether it's just paint or whether in fact it's just dirt and dust. Take a look at our website and you'll see the differences between blasted and non-blasted. And if you require any information, do give us a call. It's time to plaster. So I use a product which is actually available from a company called Anglia Lime, based in Sudbury. So add about 4 inches of water into the bottom of your pail, and then start mixing in. And this is a fine lime, which contains small fibre elements, which gives it its strength and allows it to resist cracking, and gives you much better properties for the material when it's fully cured. Right, you can use several different methods to actually mix this material. I only ever mix just enough that I can use in sort of 10 or 15 minutes. It's easy to remix another batch. But you can either use a paint scraper or a trowel, or even an electric drill, or a part that you put on an electric drill, which will give you a good mix. Don't ever over mix it though. What tends to happen with the electric mixer is that it actually collects all the fibres on the blades and you end up with no fibres in your plaster. So give your plaster a good mix, let it have a little bit of a soak. That's obviously a little bit too wet, but once you've fully mixed it, you can use it within sort of 15-20 minutes. It doesn't go off that quickly, but on a hot day you will find it will go off. A little bit wet, so let's add a little bit more of this plaster. The plaster is readily available. You can either have it delivered or you can go and collect it directly from Sudbury. Right, and once that's all nicely mixed up and the water's soaked in, that will then make a really nice thick paste. What you want to try and do is to actually get it just so that it actually stays on the float or the little trowel that you've got when you shake it. If it's too dry, it's very, very difficult to push onto the wallboard, and if it's too wet, well, you'll probably never get it on the wall. you'll probably have more of it all over the floor. Right, okay, this looks like it's just about ready to use. Let me just see if it'll... Yep, look at that. It just stays on the float there. It's stiff enough not to move too much, but loose enough to go straight onto the wall. Right, let's start plastering. So the first thing to do is actually to put some tape around the beams to protect them from the plaster. Very difficult to get plaster off of beams, even though they are dirty. So work your way right the way around the framing, making sure that the tape is nice and tight all the way around. And if necessary, if you're worried about your plastering skills, just add a little piece of plastic at the bottom down to the floor, just so that you don't get it all over the floor as well. Right, so you can start plastering pretty much wherever you like, and the idea is just to initially get the plaster actually on the wall. And as you can see, this plaster is actually sticking quite nicely to my little trowel. Right, I've used a small trowel here because we're only doing a little sample here, just so that you can get a close-up view of what's going on. But once you've got the plaster on there, just keep pushing it and spreading it quite evenly across the face of the board. And you can do this just layering up, or you can actually start by sliding it down all the gaps all the way down to the bottom. Don't worry too much about using too much plaster. You're sort of aiming for something like 4 to 5 millimeters, but you know, I wouldn't measure it. So what you want to do is just to get that float moving backwards and forward to try and get it as flat as possible. Don't forget that if you're actually joining two pieces of the fibreboard together, you need to put a little bit of sort of standard plasterboard tape over the top of the joint, and this avoids it cracking over a period of time. It's a good practice anyway. Right, so one of the problems with plaster is getting into those corners where you've got a triangle. Well, I use a little tiny palette knife, and that allows me to get into there. It's a triangular shape, so it helps you get right into the corner, and you can just spend a little bit of time just pushing the plaster into that corner and just making it good. The longer you leave the plaster, the harder it gets, and when you put pressure on with your little tool, actually you can get quite a good smooth finish even with a small pointed trowel. So keep up the work and you'll get there. Don't forget, it doesn't actually need to be dead smooth, because a dead smooth wall doesn't quite look right in an old house. So if you've got some little lumps and bumps, don't worry too much about it, because by the time you put a couple of coats of paint on that, they'll all disappear and it will look like a professional job. Right, I would give that sort of probably half a day, 3/4 of a day to start to dry off. And once it's started to dry off, you can go back over it with your float and just make sure it's as smooth as you want it to be. Then possibly leave it overnight, maybe until the following day or late in the following day, and then you're ready for the next stage. Right, okay, let's assume it's now dry. All you need to do is to use a razor blade and cut very carefully between the actual plaster itself and where the tape is against the wood. And you cut this all the way around and then slowly peel away the tape, leaving a really nice close finish between the plaster and the wall. Right, there you go. That's the sample panel finished. I hope you've enjoyed that bit, because that just sort of shows you at close quarters just how to sort of construct the frame around, get the insulation in, and of course plaster over the top. Right, so that's the sample done. What I actually wanted to go on to show you was a section which I'd done in my own home. This is actually an internal wall, which is why I've used ordinary insulation there. What you don't want to do is use ordinary insulation, the fluffy stuff, on an outside wall, because when it gets wet, it stays wet. So you must use Celotex. You shouldn't use this at all. But anyway, I'm going to take you through the process fairly quickly of actually doing the wall in my own home. So this is the finished article. I've done the plastering. As you can see, I've cleaned the beams using a media blast, and that's brought them up really nice and clean. The walls are a bit patchy because they've only just had sort of one quick coat of paint on just to seal them. Right, let's get started. Insulation is in place, and what we're now doing is just to mark up the salivite boarding just to make sure that it fits nice and snugly again inside between the beams. You'll notice that these beams actually are really rough. There's loads of paint on them, a lot of dead wood, and a lot of stain on them as well. Later on I'll be showing you how to clean the beams, and for this particular job I've elected to do the blasting after I've fitted this solid white boarding. Right, the washers again. Right, this time we're going to be fitting probably 6 or 7 washers, maybe 8, around that celluloid boarding to hold it nice and firm. I've actually used quite thin beading or battening around the inside, so what I've had to do is to cut the edge off of the washer so that it actually fits closer to the wall, so that the screw will go straight into the timber frame. Right, let's put some plaster on the wall then. Again, we're using a lime plaster with fibres in. Obviously it's mixed up reasonably stiff, but not too stiff. You want to be able to put it on the wall and get a good finish. You'll notice that I haven't taped the beams all the way around this one, and the reason is because it's quite a small panel that I'm actually plastering, and also I'm going to blast the beams afterwards to get them nice and clean. So again, working from any position on the panel, just draw up the material. Try to get it on in a sensible sort of thickness all the way over. But don't worry too much if it's a bit thicker in some places as in others. That just adds to the texture of the panel. And again, as I said earlier, what you're trying not to do is to get it sort of too flat. So for most people, you should be able to get a reasonable finish on there, and once it's painted, it'll look absolutely superb. So a successfully finished panel, all ready for painting. Okay, and here's the finished item. And if you want your beams cleaned, do contact us. We'd be only too pleased to help. If you like this channel, please subscribe.